Okay, my name is Lee Ann Chafee, and today I'm standing in for Jim Gall, who normally hosts. He is our colleague at a conference in Spain, which sounds like the best place to go on a conference. Today we're welcoming Caitlin Moats, who's our colleague at UW-Tacoma and is much beloved. When she's not working as a project manager at UW-Tacoma, she brews beer, which she recently won an awesome award for, a beer that sounds delightful, Morning Brew IPA. And today we'll be hearing more about understanding beer, the history and science of brewing. If you haven't been before, our speaker gives the presentation. We learn a lot of cool things. Then we have a short break where you can have another beverage. We can all take a break if we want. We'll do a raffle drawing for 2 cool prizes. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So thank you for being here, Caitlin.
All right, y'all, give me 1 second to adjust this. This is a little shorter than I am. I am quite tall in case you missed it. There you go. All right, well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to the Leannes for hosting in Jim's absence. As they said, my name is Caitlin Moats, and I'm here today to talk to you about the history and science of beer. I made it as straightforward of a title as I possibly could to get this off of there, because this is understanding beer. So a little bit about me, first and foremost, is that exactly like they said, I have no business talking about beer. My day job is I am the IT project manager over at UW-Tacoma. So if you're affiliated with UW, if you know Bill Fritz, he's my boss, and that tells you everything you need to know if you know Bill, but he's absolutely fantastic. But that's what I do. I am a project manager by day. But I've been a home brewer since 2018. And as she said, in 2020, I took 3rd place in the specialty IPA category with my beer. It was Morning Brew. It was a coffee IPA, which I recognize some of you are like, oh God, I can't imagine a worse thing. I hate coffee and IPAs. Why would I do that? But if you like coffee and IPAs, chances are you're gonna like it. I tried one up at Wander Brewing once, and I was like, I can recreate this, and I did, and I won an award for it. I was feeling super proud because that was my first award I ever won and my first recipe I ever won. So very proud about that one. I am a UW graduate myself, so even though I am in IT, my undergraduate degree was in biology at UW Bothell. That's where I hail from, did a lot of work at UW Bothell. So I am UW through and through. But that being said, I am also a WSU Master Gardener, so I'm kind of playing on both sides of the field here. At home, I do grow my own hops because they came with the house, and when they said the house came with hops, I said, oh, hell yes, that is exactly what I'm going to do. So we have our own hops growing at home, and it's fantastic. I'm also a trivia host. If anybody wants to play trivia on Thursday nights, find me after the fact, because that is what I do also. I do way too many things, all that to say. And so here's a little bit about my life. You know, up there in the upper right hand is me and my fiance in Spain. The day we landed in Barcelona, they were having a beer festival. It was one of the happiest days of my life, especially when you get €2 pours. That picture on the right is our first brew day at our new house, trying to get all that set up. And so that was really fun. And then just our cats, because who doesn't like looking at cats? That's Fergie and Dr. Things. So, and right now, my big kick that I'm on is stouts. Any stout lovers in here? A couple of you. Okay, no one needs to bump up those numbers, but I get it. Stouts can be a little bit too malty, but stouts are typically what I'm reaching for, even in the summer lately. So we're going to start off with the history of beer, with a huge freaking asterisk on this. The asterisk is that beer has been going on. We've been consuming beer for over, 10,000 years. And so trying to get 10,000 years of beer history into 3 minutes is not really going to be super viable. So I'm going to do my best to try and cover all my bases, but please know that there are way much more that goes into beer than what I'm going to show here. So the first thing is that the earliest archaeological evidence that we have for beer is about 7,000 BC from Sumeria, which is in modern day Iraq and Kuwait. Our first chemical evidence of beer, actually seeing like beer stone, which is kind of this residue that is left behind after you get done brewing, was found about 3,000 BC. So we know that people have been brewing some sort of beer for a very long time. Of course, humans have been getting drunk even longer than that, because, you leave some berries out. The wild yeast is going to come get it, and you drink it, and you're like, oh, this rotten fruit is amazing. So we've been getting drunk a lot longer than that. But beer really started about 7,000 BC, maybe a little bit sooner, but we'll never be able to know who brewed the first beer, just like we'll never be able to know who brewed the first wine. So the Sumerians were kind of considered the original brewers. They were the ones who kind of went, oh, this malt that I left out in the rain that's turned into yeast is delicious. Okay, how can I further refine this into something that I can actually consume? And beer in this age, way back in the day, was less of what we think of now with our lovely drinks with all the carbonation. It was actually more like oatmeal. It was grueling. It was very thick. It was more like you ate your beer than drank your beer. What a weird concept to think of now, right? So the Sumerians were the ones who were originally doing this. And from there, it ended up making its way into Egyptian culture. And the Egyptians were the ones who improved on the process significantly. Everybody was consuming beer in those days in the Egyptian culture, from peasant to pharaoh. Everybody consumed beer. The reason for this was because A, the water was potable. Suddenly you can, if you boil water, makes it a lot safer to drink. Even if you have no idea what germ theory is, you recognize boiled water, tastes better, don't die, sounds great. The second thing is that all of the grains that they were using were providing calories. So when they were unable to get enough calories from their food, they were able to get it from their beer. So their beer was a very supplemental way of surviving rather than us who was just like, Friday night, I'll have a beer. Of note, though, beer was not consumed by the Greeks and the Romans. They saw it as barbarian. In this case, barbarian is the original term of barbarian, which to the Greeks and the Romans is anybody who's not us. That was really their definition. Barbarian is anybody who's not Greek or Roman, they're barbarian. Now we can see how that's evolved into modern times, but that's what it was. So they didn't really do a whole lot of spreading, the Greeks and the Romans, in the about 300 BC. They were happy with their fine wines and don't get me wrong, I'm a wine lover too. I'm not trying to just completely poo-poo all over wine. But after the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe took on Catholicism, and as those monasteries were spreading, they were also establishing breweries along the way. The reason for this is because A, to sustain themselves, just like I said earlier with the Egyptians, you add in all those calories and all that water that you're suddenly able to drink. But also it made a great place for weary travelers to stop in. You know, you're walking along and a monk comes out and says, hey, you want some beer? You're gonna say yes, you're gonna come in for the night and hang out with the monks, which is exactly what they were trying to do. And now this is kind of manifested in modern culture where we're looking at things, you know, our Trappist beers, our Abbey beers, they still come from that original when Catholicism was spreading across Europe. So moving forward even faster, like I said, we're already, that was 500 AD. So yeah, we're moving real fast here. So about 1100 AD, Hildegard von Bingen, who later goes on to become Saint Hildegard, she was the one to kind of first describe hops as a particularly useful plant, one that is excellent for physical health and preserved all sorts of drinks. And so she was the first one to start writing about it. Before this point, beer had not used hops at all. They were using something called Groot, which, yes, it sounds like the character Groot. It's fruit spelled with a G. And what Groot was it's literally an old German translation for the word herb. And it was all sorts of herbs and spices that they would add into their beers. And so we're talking things like heather and mugwort and yarrow and mint and juniper and ginger, all sorts of things like that. And so when hops started becoming a thing, the Catholic Church, they were not happy about that. They started protesting mightily against the addition of the hops because they were the primary suppliers of Groot. And so when hops start coming in, they're a lot cheaper to produce. They're a lot more economical, a lot easier. There was less regulation around them because Groot was highly regulated by the Catholic Church and all the dioceses. So the Catholic Church was very angry that hops started coming into the fold. But nevertheless, as we all know, hops persisted, and hops then became like the premier addition to the drink. So much so we've all heard of this one, the Reinheitsgebot in 1516. This was a law laid down by William IV of Bavaria, basically saying that all beer made here has to be made with water, barley, or hops. That's it. Those are your only options. If it contains anything else, we're not going to call it a beer. That is what they said. Eventually, yeast was added after Louis Pasteur went, oh, hey, guys, we actually need the yeast to make the beer, just so you know. They're like, oh, okay, we'll allow that. It's fine. We'll allow that in. But the Reinheitsgebot was actually in practice up until about the 1980s, in which case they just modified it a little bit, but Germany still has modern beer purity laws, which is really interesting to me. It's kind of like this was the first and longest lasting FDA document that they have was the Reinheitsgebot. It lasted through the unification of Germany in 1871, so they took their beer quite seriously. Moving forward into the 1800s, with at that point, America and England and Europe had a big divide. America started taking on more of these lagers, like our classic Budweisers and our Coors beers, the ones that everybody grew up knows and loves, while England then took the opportunity to focus on ales, our English style ales, our brown ales, our nut ales, anything of that sort. That is what they started focusing on. That's how you get your Smithwick's and your Sam Smiths, all sorts of things like that. And then something really funny happened in America is we went through Prohibition. Anybody hopefully don't remember that? You all are quite much younger than that. But Prohibition said that your beer, or you can't have malt liquor. Well, guess what? Rice and corn, they're not malt. And that's exactly what all the brewers said. So they started changing out all of their recipes with corn and malt base, because the corn and rice base, because the corn and rice will still put off sugars that can still be fermented into alcohol. And so that's how they got around it during Prohibition. And it kind of stuck around. That is why our Budweiser today has so much corn and rice in it as compared to the craft beers of today, where we're using predominantly malts. It's because they switched the recipes so long ago and they kind of went, well, we're not going to change it now. It works great. So we're going to keep going with it. So that was really a huge marker in the time of the beer history, was that basically they had to change it all up and they kept it. And then beginning in the 1970s, there was a big renewal in craft beer, such as places like this, not necessarily Seven Seas opening up in the 70s, but people were realizing that beer could just be more than what we get at the grocery store in those giant kegs or in whatever the bottles that we have. This can really be an art form. And so in the 70s, especially in the United States, this is when beer started taking off. And it's kind of really amazing to see how many breweries have popped up in the meantime, both the United States, obviously in Washington, we're all very aware that we are a brewery central around here, but all around the world, craft beer became a thing. And so that takes us to today. We are here enjoying craft beers that all of this history has set us up to be prepared for. One thing I really want to call out though is women's role in beer. So oftentimes, especially in modern days, beer is a manly thing. It's a masculine thing. Men drink it. Women, we have to stick with our wines or whatever. We're pushing that envelope more and more. Obviously, I'm up here with my beer talking about beer, but this wasn't always the case. Originally, women were the ones who were in charge of the beer. So in ancient Mesopotamia, clay tablets indicate that the majority of brewers were women and that they were well respected. They had both of these things going for them because they knew how to make the beer. To the point where the Mesopotamians, who were not really prone to making female gods, had 3 female gods for brewing. Of course, there is Ninkasi. We all heard of Ninkasi, especially because of that brewery in Eugene, which makes fantastic beer, I gotta say. But she really refers to the production of beer. After that, there's Ceres. She just generally refers to beer. I don't know why we don't talk about her more, because Ceres, that sounds cool, just the goddess of enjoyment, or of beer in general. And then finally, Siduri, who refers to the enjoyment of beer, probably my favorite goddess of all, if we're going strictly by this nomenclature, because boy, howdy. So they had 3 goddesses. Women were well respected. Throughout the ages, it was one of the few trades or industry that was available to women. Brewing was considered women's work. They were known as alewives or brewsters. Brewster is the feminine term of brewer, just for what it's worth. And literally, raise the children, clean the house, brew the beer. That was one of their jobs. And it may very well be one of the places that the concept of the modern witch comes from, which is really interesting to me. So when about in the 1300s, if a woman had extra beer to sell, she made too much beer, she would stick a broomstick out her door saying, hey, I've got beer, come in, I will sell you some of my beer. At the same time, they were boiling their beer in giant cauldrons. They had cats that would protect the malt from all of the rats that were getting into it. And just as fashion of the time, they wore pointy hats. So we don't know for sure if this is the case, but I really like the concept that roosters spawned the modern concept of the witch. This all changed after the Black Plague, and resources became a lot harder to acquire. And the reason this is suddenly, it's basically what we experienced with the pandemic, supply chain issues. And so suddenly acquiring supplies became very expensive, and you needed capital to be able to purchase those supplies and then turn them into beer. And at the time, the only people that had capital were those who were white males, and they were the ones who then were able to take the entire brewing process
and commercialize it because they had the money to be able to do so. So that was in the 1800s is kind of when it's, or excuse me, the 1300s is when it started kind of getting wrenched away from women because they didn't have the ability to brew beer anymore. So in modern times, obviously this is changing. We're having more female focused breweries and just more inclusive breweries in general, which is fantastic. But I just always want to make sure we call out what women's role in beer has been up to this point, and not that this is a new thing for women to be jumping into beer, but this is a consistent thing. Told you that was history, and I am going to trip over this course. I'm watching all of your eyes watching my feet, like seeing whether or not I'm going to eat it. I'm gonna make it. But that was what the history. Like I said, there's so much more history that goes into it. Look into it. It is so fascinating. There's chances that we wouldn't be here as civilization as we know it if we didn't have beer because of all the deals that were made over drinking. I think it's really interesting to think about. But now we're going to move into more of the sciencey portions. And to do that, I think we need to understand what is beer. All right? What is beer? So by definition, beer is an alcoholic drink produced by the brewing and fermentation of starches mainly derived from cereal grains. That's the key phrase right there at the end, is mainly derived from cereal grains. Starches kind of just mean sugars, and so anything could be wine, in this case, could be a beer if we didn't have that mainly derived from cereal grains. So cereal grains, like what I'm talking about, the barley, the malt, oats, things like that. But that is at its core what beer is. Fermented drink from starches with grains. Okay. So what is your beer made from? We kind of talked about this already with the Reinheitsgebot, but at its core, of course, beer is made from water. Thank God, because like I said, I don't want to chew my beer anymore like they did way back in the day. It is made of grain. Notice I didn't say necessarily malt. It's made of grains. We'll go over that. It's made of hops, and it is made of yeast. At its core, all beers are made of these four things. Obviously, in modern days, we add all sorts of extra things to our beer, such as coffee to your IPA, because why not? I made a ginger Hefeweizen because that just sounded good. That would not have passed the Reinheitsgebot, things like that. So, but all of my beers still include these four things. Before we get to the ingredients, though, I want to go over what a brew day looks like. Okay, how many of you have done home brewing in here before? Okay, so some of you will, this will look familiar, and this is for all those who do not brew. This is when I start getting like, actually, we do it this way because there are 100 different ways to brew beer. Everybody does it differently. So I'm trying to be as general as I can in the process of brewing here, but this is in general, whether or not you're doing it a home brew or a commercial brew, this is how beer is made. So first thing is first is grain is combined with hot water to extract the sugars from the grain. You're effectively making a tea, but instead of using tea leaves, you're using grain. All right. Then after that tea combination, that is called a wort, W-O-R-T. I know, very appetizing sounding. You collect that in a kettle and then you start boiling that wort. So basically it is this super sugary water that you end up boiling. During that boil, that's when you add your hops. That's how hops are added. You add them to the beginning, middle, or end, depending on what you're trying to achieve. And then after you finish your boil, you try and cool down your wort as fast as possible. There's a lot of reasons for this, mostly because there are a lot of chemical reactions going on during the boil, and you want to try and stop those chemical reactions as fast as you can after you're done. Brewing a brew day is kind of interesting because there's a lot of hurry up and wait. And you're waiting and waiting, and then holy crap, I've got 15 things to do at the same time. And that's when you pull in your spare friends to try and help you out. But you chill down your beer. And actually, correction, not beer. It's not beer at this point. It's still just wort. It's just been boiled wort. So then you move it over to your fermenter, the thing that's going to be hanging out in the next 6 weeks. And you're going to pitch your yeast. That's what adding yeast is called. We made it fancy. Pitch your yeast. So you add your yeast into your fermentation chamber, and then you really wait. This is when you really wait. It takes 2 weeks to a month, maybe 6 weeks, depending on the kind of beer you make. All beers are different. Some of them will literally ferment. I've had a beer ferment in like 4 days. And I'm like, is this even done? Is this okay? And then I've had ones that literally took like a month and a half. And that's just how it goes. Once it's all done fermenting and it's officially beer, you then can either finish it. Some people add finishing things. That's when you can add additional herbs or whatever you want. And then you either bottle or keg it. So this is what the general brew day process looks like. Obviously, this is more what home brew looks like, because I don't have access to these giant fermentation tanks that Seven Seas does. So, but they do the same process of wort, boil, ferment, nice and simple. So going into our ingredients, let's start breaking things down a little bit more. Water is the one I'm going to pay the least attention to, and that's not fair. I want to call that out. There is so much that goes into water and how just literally water can change your beer. But it's at least complicated at the same time. So when we're talking about water, obviously it is the bulk of your beer. Again, we're drinking our beer, not eating our beer here. So the pH of your water will affect the pH of your beer, which in turn expresses how beer is expressed to your palate. If you have a more acidic beer, chances are you're not going to be able to taste your hop flavors as well, versus if you have a more basic beer, you're going to be able to have those hop flavors brought out a little bit more just by changing the water. It provides seasoning from the sulfate to chloride ratio. So water inherently is not pure. It's got tons of things in it. Of course, if you buy DI water or distilled water, it's going to be far more pure. But really, you do want to have some sort of seasoning within your water. Of course, sodium and potassium and magnesium, things like that. You don't necessarily want to use tap water because it's been had a lot of fluoride and things added to it, which I believe is that one. Yep. If you have chlorinated water or things like city water, it's going to add off flavors into your beer. And that's not what we're looking for. So what we actually do, this is a picture of the Olympia Artesian Well. Has anybody been there? Downtown Olympia? Yeah, that my two people from Olympia know exactly where that's at because they live there. It is this literally artesian well, and it's an aquifer that just springs up, and we go down when it's ready for brew day. We grab some 5-gallon tanks or containers and fill up our water, and that is what we use for brew day. We are able to look up online what the different composition is, what the levels of iron are in our water and things like that, because it's already been posted by the city, so it works out really well for us. But if you want to, you can always get distilled water and start throwing things in, seeing what you want it to taste like. One thing to know about water, though, is that it accentuates flavors and can really help refine your beer. If you've got like a good beer, but you want to make it a great beer, the next thing you should look at is your water. However, it will not fix a bad beer. You can have the most perfect beer making water in existence, and if you throw a bad recipe on top of it, it's not going to work out. And unfortunately, that's all I can talk about with water, just because I don't have time. You could do 2 hours on water alone. It is so interesting, all the things that go into it. But I'm going to move into grains. So grains. It is quite warm in here. Grain and mashing. So brewing has a bunch of fun terms, one of which is mashing. And that's kind of what this looks like. So remember how I was talking about we were making that grain tea? That's what it looks like if you're using all grain. So grain obviously is the foundation of beer. You do not have beer without grain. Hard stop. The mashing process is what extracts the sugars from the grains, and these are called fermentables. Anything that can be fermented, which means going through that process of fermentation, being consumed by the yeast and producing alcohol are all called fermentables. The amount of grain that you have is just as important as the type of grain. So we'll explore this in a second, but the different ratios of grain that you have can affect the flavors greatly. And we're talking in terms of pounds. You know, you have a pound of this, a half pound of this, 19 pounds of that. It's all fun in ratios to play with. So basically all you have to do, this part's nice and simple. You heat up water, you add it to your grain. You guys are able to follow those steps very clearly there? Heat up water, add the grain. And there you go, you've made your mash. Good job, you guys. So simple. So you literally just add hot water and milk grains, let it sit. We set a timer for about an hour, go inside, prepare our next step, watch TV, things like that. And then when you're done, you start collecting the wort, and that's what we're doing here. So all of this is our brewing kettle. All of this that's in there is basically that tea that we are extracting from all of those grains. If you take, as it's draining, if you take your finger and like swipe it through the stream, it's like a really sugary water. It's kind of gross, smells good. I kind of like it at this point though, because I think I just had so much of it to taste my beer, like pre-taste my beer, that it's fine now. But it's this really sweet because it's got a lot of those sugars within it. So speaking of the different kinds of malts, there are so many kinds of malts that are available. So this is just kind of a select few. One of which is the black barley, which will make a nice roastier beer, something in your oatmeal stouts or your black IPA, something really dark with a lot of body. Caramel malts, and chocolate malts, they impart those kinds of flavors into your beer. They are not inherently caramel and chocolate that you're adding straight into your beer. But we've all had, like I said, a nice stout, and you're like, oh yes, it's got that nice chocolatey flavor behind it. Again, they're not adding chocolate, they're adding chocolate malts. There's Maris Otter on the lower left right here, which is a very classic, like English style ale grade. Something that is used a lot more in the English styles, nice, pale, not too much body behind it. But then we can add other things aside from just straight malts. We can add flaked oats, which add another flavor to it. It's just oatmeal stouts, exactly that, adding more body. And then we could even add rice bowls. Rice bowls are fantastic because they do absolutely nothing to your beer. Isn't that great? Absolutely nothing. They are really great for creating space in your mash. So sometimes if you have like a fully wheat beer, you add your water to it, it becomes like a solid cake. You can't drain anything out of it. It's just solid. So you can add some rice bowls that have no flavor. They just create volume, create some space for things to be able to drain through a lot faster. So as I was talking about earlier, the amounts matter. So let's take a look at a 5-gallon oatmeal stout. This is one of my recipes. So if I was going to brew 5 gallons of this beer, just 5, I would go down, take my butt to the homebrew store and get 14 pounds of pale Turo, which is a very generic grain that is used in beer. It's probably in almost every single one of the beers you have here, probably. 14 pounds of pale Turo, 2 pounds of that chocolate, again, not actual chocolate, but that chocolate malt. 2 pounds of the flaked oats, and then 8 pounds of crystal 90L. So 90L means 90 Lugabon, means how long it's been roasted. But in total, I've got 26 pounds of grain. I recognize that those numbers don't mean much to you just yet. But let's compare that to the 5-gallon Hefeweizen. Just look at that total amount of grain at the bottom. It is literally half, right? So I use 9 pounds of pale wheat, 3 pounds of Pilsner, and 1 pound of rice hulls, like I said, to kind of create that volume and space for a total of 13 pounds of grain. Same volume of beer, half the grain. Why is that? Anybody? Yeah. Correct. Yeah. So you guys didn't quite hear him. It's pulling more flavor out of the oatmeal stout than it is pulling out of the Hefeweizen. And if you think about your beers, you've got a Hefeweizen and a stout in front of you. Which one has a fuller body? It's absolutely the stout. The Hefeweizens are your nice, easy drinking summer day, having a great time. You don't necessarily want to have an oatmeal stout on a hot summer day because it's a full body. It's going to be heavy and sit in your stomach like that. And that's one of the easiest ways that you can just change the body of your beer, just change how much grain you're throwing into something. Okay, I know we're going fast because there's a lot of stuff to cover. I could talk about this literally all week, so we're doing great. Hops. I have a special love in my heart for hops. IPAs were my first love after Pilsners, after I got used to Pilsners, and absolutely fantastic, but hops are amazing. So let's go over a little bit of history of the hop real quick. So the first documented hop cultivation was in 736 AD in the Hallertau region of Germany. If you've ever heard of like the Hallertau hops or the Hallertau Mittelfrüh, that is exactly what we're talking about, is those kinds of hops. Those hops are called noble hops. We'll go over that in a second. And the US is actually the largest hop producer in the world, with the Yakima and Willamette valleys being particularly well suited to hop growing. So I think we are the second or third largest hop producer in the US. So hops are very near and dear to us. Even more so, has anybody ever heard of Ezra Meeker? Okay, yeah. So that means you know something about Puyallup. Ezra Meeker was basically the guy who founded Puyallup. And when he came over here from England, he brought a ton of East Kent Goldings kinds of hops, basically brought them over, planted them, and went, holy cow, Puget Sound can grow hops. We should put a center right here. And that's effectively what he did. And so that's how we started growing hops here in the Northwest, was Ezra Meeker, the guy that made Puyallup, also started this hop culture. And today there are more than 250 recognized varieties of hops. This is nowhere near what you're going to find in your local homebrew store, or even like the biggest homebrew store on the planet. There are just so many, but it's nice that we have variety. So what's the hop? Like I said, there are a ton of different varieties. So hops are the flowers of the Humulus lupulus plant, which is really difficult to say. It's got a lot of U's in there. So literally hops are the flower. We are adding flowers to our beer. And they provide bitters and flavoring and aromatics to the beer. So it's not just, we all think of hops, they provide bitterness. We think of our IPAs, the more, we know our IPAs have more hops in them, but they also provide other kinds of flavors and aromatics, the way that you pick up your beer and you smell it. Oh yes, I've got floral notes, a little bit of orange and citrus. You can be just as bougie with like tasting beer as you can with wine for what it's worth. You absolutely can do that. But it also acts as an antibiotic and a stability agent. So one of the things that brewers, especially home brewers, are on the lookout for is spoiled beer. Bacteria gets into your fermentation chamber, and if you're not paying attention, at the end of the 6 weeks, you go to drink it and you have a spoiled beer. And that's because bacteria got in there and infected it. It's literally called an infection of the beer. So hops act as kind of this natural antibiotic to stave some of that off. But they also make it more shelf stable, allows us our hops to stay longer. IPAs, they don't hang around too long, but like high alcohol beers will hang out forever on your shelf. Well, if we didn't have hops, your IPA would be bad with inside of like 2 weeks. Nobody wants that, especially if you're waiting that long to drink the beer. Come on, that's not worth it. So some of the commonly used hops that are available, and this is by far not a comprehensive list. Mosaic hops, they have a very strong citrus and pine and blueberry and peach. And you guys are like, no, they don't. It's a hop. It's a flower. It smells. Like I said, you can get bougie with this. Cascade hops, they are the classic pale ale flavor. You think of a pale ale, and it's going to have Cascade hops, especially around here. Got a little bit of that spiciness, more grapefruit and citrus wine notes, specifically the rind. Saz, they are historic noble hops. So noble hops are those like 4 brands of hops that came over from Germany when they first figured it out in that Hallertau region. So Saz is one of those hops. It's got a lot of herbal, woody, kind of a mild spice to it. Amarillo, it's a really floral hop with some earthy flavors. The Hallertau Mittelfrüh, which is missing its umlaut over the U in Mittelfrüh. It's another noble hop. It's got a lot of woodiness with sage, rosemary, and pine. And then you guys are like, no, it doesn't. I drink beer. No, it doesn't. I'm not drinking a tree. Then we've got Simcoe hops, which are really good for bittering beer. They're great for adding in right up the front of the beer and bittering it. And there's some subtle stone fruit flavors in there. And then finally, Galaxy. This has been the latest like hop hit. It is the most recently developed and released hop. And it's the citrus bittery hop that brings tropical fruit flavors. It's very much reminiscent of the Cascade, except more so. It's just like if you took the Cascade and turned it up to 11. So you can kind of think though, you can kind of realize now that why people got into craft brewing. If you're like, well, if I use this hop in this combination with this bait, great, and I do this, that's how we're starting to get into the art. You guys can see why, right? And as we're getting into these totally minute flavors that, again, no one really thinks about. Okay, so how do we actually use hops in brewing? We use them. You guys saw you guys saw when I added them. They're in the boil. That's all you need to know, right? No, not that simple. So hops are added during and then sometimes after the boil. That's okay. That's okay. Any hops that are added earlier to the boil are going to impart mostly bitterness. So you can have the same hop. If you add it to the beginning of a beer, at the beginning of the boil, it's going to cause more bitterness. The reason being is that those alpha acids, which is they make up the bittering of the beer, are becoming isomerized. Isomerized? Isomerized. I'm gonna go with that. Basically, what that means is it's taking the original alpha acid arrangement, kind of adjusting it a little bit, and that's what's releasing all those bitter flavors. Now, conversely, you add hops later into the boil, toward the end of the boil, and you're mostly going to get aroma and flavor out of those hops, and not so much of that bitterness. Again, because none of that alpha acid is going on under that isomerization. Therefore, it's not being exposed to the heat. It's just literally being like if you infused your tea, you're adding more tea to your tea. Amazing how that works. So by example, we're going to my 5-gallon IPA, which this is the award winner if anybody wanted to take notes. At 60 minutes, which is another thing, when we're brewing, we count backwards in time. So 60 minutes is when the boil starts, adding in half an ounce of warrior hops. So I add this half an ounce of hops. So what's going to happen to it? What's its job? Bittering. Yep. So this half ounce is going to provide a lot of the bitterness in my IPA. At the 30-minute mark, I'm going to add an ounce each of Crystal and Cascade. The reason I'm doing it halfway through is I still want it to go under that isomerization process a little bit. I want some of those alpha acids, but I also want some of those flavors that can impart. At 0 minutes, this is flame out, the boil stops, adding 1 more ounce of crystal. And what happens to these guys? Smell and flavor. That's all they're doing. They're not imparting any additional bitterness. They are just there to add flavor. And then because this is an IPA, 5 days later, I will dry hop an extra 1 ounce of crystal. And dry hop just means we are well done with the process. It's in its fermentation chamber. I'm just going to throw hops in there and really try and bring out that hop flavor and hop profile. That is what I'm trying to do by adding in all these different hop additions. So you kind of see how we add them changes, how even the flavor, you can have the same hop doing the entire beer and have it cover all of your bases from bitterness to flavor to aroma just across the board. And that's what they look like if you buy them from the store. You're not typically adding whole cone hops. You can, which is whole cone hops are what you think of when you see a hop. That's whole cone. You absolutely can do that. Your fresh hop IPAs are always going to be those whole cone hops. They literally rip them off the plant and Yakima, bring it over to us, and then dump them in. But if you're just buying it from your homebrew store, they come in little pellets, which is really nice. All right, on to the fun one. Yeast. Always a fun word to say too, yeast. Yeast is incredibly important. So we're going to talk about the yeasty boys. I've been waiting for like 6 months just to make that joke, the yeasty boys. So on left here, we have Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is our top fermenting yeast, or the yeast that is primarily involved with creating ales. On the right side, we have Saccharomyces pastorianus, which is our lager yeast. So there are a ton of different varieties of yeast. If you go into your homebrew store, you'll be like, I want some yeast. And they're going to go, great. What do you want? Yeast. Fantastic. Just like hops and just like with grains, there are so many different options and varieties. But chances are they're going to belong to these 2 species. At the end of the day, either Saccharomyces cerevisiae or pastorianus. There are a couple other like adjacent yeasts, but these are the 2 primary biggest ones. So now's the chemistry time. Everybody loves chemistry. That's all you guys need to know. That's fermentation. How easy is that? Fantastic. Anybody know, except for you, I'm sure you know right off the bat, what that first thing is on the right? Yes. Sugar, right off the bat. So we got sugar. Sugar is then going to turn into, what's the next thing? It's got an OH group. Yes. Ethanol. Thank you for saying ethanol too, and not alcohol, because not all alcohols are the same. But yeah, ethanol turns into 2 ethanol, and then this one, I'll help you guys out. CO2. Parts out CO2. Okay, cool. So we're turning sugar into ethanol and carbon dioxide. How are we doing this? That process. What's going to go here? What's going to go here? It's the yeast. You guys called it. Amazing that it's yeast in my yeast section. Funny how that works. So literally though, what the yeast does is it goes through, eats all of the sugar and poops out carbon dioxide and ethanol. You are literally enjoying yeast poop. You're welcome for that. Think about that the next time you take a sip of your beer. It is literally yeast waste. Exactly what you should be doing, toasting right over there. So kind of example of what this looks like. So this is a really cool chart, I gotta say. For my fiance's birthday or something, I got him this thing that measures our fermentation. It basically takes the amount of bubbles that are coming out of our fermenter, measures how fast they're going, and they can make inferences about how our beer is doing. See how long it's been fermenting, see if it's still fermenting, things like that. So we've got 2 lines up here. The kind of tealy line on the bottom is average bubbles per minute. So this is what this device measured for bubbles per minute. And then on top, we have specific gravity. Specific gravity is what we use to measure how much alcohol is actually within our beer. We take a measure of gravity before we boil the beer and let it ferment, and then we take a gravity after. And the difference between that, we do a lot of fun math, and that produces what our beer, or how much alcohol our beer has. So the gravity ultimately goes down as those sugars are being consumed, yeast is pooping out, not solids, and so the gravity is going down and down. And if you notice, these are going down at the same time. They're following the same curve. The reason being is that as yeast is fermenting, you can kind of see when yeast stops liking eating things anymore. It's like, I'm running out of food, I am swimming in my own waste. What the heck? You can kind of see where that curve stops. But you notice that the bubbles per minute drop off pretty immediate down to, 1 bubble per minute, maybe none bubbles per minute. But as we let it go, the gravity still comes down because the remaining yeast in there is still finding ways to get in there and eat all of the little sugars that are still available. So some things that you want to consider with your yeast, because again, even though I said there's two yeast, not all yeasts are the same. So the first thing you're going to want to think about is attenuation, which is the degree at which yeast ferments fermentable sugars. So this goes back to swimming in their own poop. We're going to come back to that a lot. I don't like swimming in my own poop, but I'm sure that some of you are more adept at it than I am in swimming in your own poop, right? And so the ones that are more adept to higher alcohol environments are having a higher attenuation. If it's got an attenuation of 60%, that means it's going to consume 60% of your fermentable sugars before it stops providing any more benefit to your beer. If you have an attenuation of 90%, which is pretty much impossible, it's going to eat as all those sugars as it can. Flocculation, which is how well the yeast clumps together and how well it determines clarity. Some of you have not brewed beer before, and that's fantastic. I hope you start after this. But one thing that happens is when you're done with your beer, it's not just sitting in its fermentation chamber as this clear, happy, ready to drink. There's this bunch of gunk at the bottom called trub, and it is leftover yeast, more byproducts. You can use it to then throw into your next beer to ferment that if you want to. I don't. That's a lot of effort and work, but you want that least yeast clumping together if you want to clear a beer because it falls out of the beer more. Higher flocculation means you're going to get a clearer beer. They clump easier, fall out easier. Lower flocculation, you might want if you're making maybe a hazy IPA or something to that effect. Something that's supposed to be that really hazy beer. Fermentation temperature. So not all beers like to ferment at the same temperature. Some like fermenting at 65 degrees. Some like fermenting at 72 degrees. And that's just how the yeast wants to react. That's how they like their environment. Just like some of us like freezing cold and some of us like warm temperatures. Yeast are the same way. Some of them work better in different temperatures. So knowing that allows you to be like, okay, I know I need to keep my fermentation temperature this for the beer to taste like the way I want it to. And then flavor profile. Different yeasts, they're not just pooping out just alcohol, they're pooping out a bunch of other things too. And not every yeast is consistent. And so those types of flavors will be imparted into your beer. That's why there are so many different kinds. How many different kinds, Caitlin? Thank you for asking. These are your common ones at least. So American ale, nice, clean, and neutral yeast. These are kind of like if you walked into your homebrew shop and said, I want an American ale yeast. They'll be like, okay, that's something we can work with. We'll figure it out. American ale, nice, clean, and neutral. It's going to focus a lot on your malts. Belgian ale. These are going to be produce fruity or estery beers, sometimes a clove flavor, just from the yeast, not necessarily from anything else you've added from your hops or from your malts. Literally just from the yeast, fruity or estery. It's used a lot in Abbey or Trappist beers. Lambics or sours. I'm not a big fan of sours, so I compare it to spoiled beer personally, but I recognize that it is not a spoiled beer. And some of you absolutely love sours, and that's great. But they are intentionally acidic and tart, and exactly that. Sour is a beer that kind of makes your face pucker. Barley wine or imperial stout. So these are some of those yeasts that I was telling you can withstand the high alcohol levels within their tank. And so these are more impervious. Yeast are more impervious to alcohol death. They're less likely to die. They can ferment longer, eat some of those sugars longer. Kolsch beer. So these provide crisp and clean finishes a lot on your lagers with a very focusing on your malts. Those are things that are quite important. You want to think about how your malt profile is coming out. We've got our wheat, which a wheat yeast is going to impart the intentional banana and clove off flavors. So Hefeweizens are a really interesting case in this because they kind of have that banana flavor to them, right? That's from the yeast. The yeast is what's producing that banana flavor. And if you enter that beer in a beer competition and don't say it's a Hefeweizen, they're going to say it's a bad beer, even though you're like, no, this tastes great. It's a Hefeweizen. They're like, oh, so it's supposed to be a Hefeweizen. It's got these off flavors in it, so you're getting a 0. But that's exactly what it's there for, is to provide those off flavors, something great for us to add an orange slice to. All right, I went over so much stuff. So really what I want you to take away from this whole night of everything I've talked about is that beer is old. It's like really, really old. It's gone through so many iterations and it will continue going through iterations. Beer is just as much of an art as it is a science. We like to think it's either completely science of, yes, it must be this exact right balance. But sometimes it's just as much of an art thinking about, okay, what flavors do I want to express? How do I want it to smell? Smell is just as important in beer as taste. Beer combinations are infinite. Again, this is exactly what I was saying with the explosion of all these craft breweries. You make a beer and you're like, this tastes good. I bet you I could sell this. And that's exactly how it works. If you think it tastes good, chances are somebody else thinks it tastes good. But we will never be able to brew every possible beer out there. So keep trying, keep making new beer combinations. And then brewing is a process that ultimately takes time and a lot of energy, but it can yield absolutely amazing results. Or in the case of a lot of us with our first beer, absolutely terrible results. My first beer did not turn out great. Most people's first beers do not turn out great, but that's fine. We don't let that deter us, because as we keep learning and keep growing, we realize that it can really just yield like amazing things that we can bond over. So if you want to learn more, I've put this entire presentation on my website already, CaitlinMoats.com, which I just literally created like a week ago. So please pardon my website. But if you want to learn more, visit your local homebrew shop. We have one right here in Puyallup, John's Homebrew and Wine Supply. John is an amazing human being who is a font of knowledge. So make sure you check him out. We also have Sound Homebrew Supply in Seattle and Georgetown. They are also equally fantastic. Unfortunately, the place where I got my start in micro homebrew in Kenmore, they are still available, but they are closing at the end of June. They've been open for about, I think, 15 years or so, and they tried to find a buyer, but yeah, very sad that another homebrew shop is going down. But again, fonts of knowledge. The American Homebrewers Association, especially if you want to get into competitions, you want to join the AHA. They are the ones who sanction most of the events. If you want to know more about the water, beerandbrewing.com/brewing-water, they go into great detail about all the different ways that water can affect your beer. You can become a cicerone. Yeah, that's a fancy word. It's basically like, what's the word for the wine people? Sommelier, thank you. I don't know how I forgot that word. It's sommelier, but for beer. I told you, they can be just as fancy. Become a cicerone, talk to your local brewer. I swear, if you just go and like, somebody tell me about beer in a brewery, you'll find somebody who will tell you everything you need to know and then some. And then a lot of breweries also offer tours, and they're happy to give tours, especially the smaller microbreweries, just because a lot of them got into it just because this is their passion and this is fun for them. And so they like sharing that. That's literally the entire reason I'm up here. Is like I said, I am a home brewer. This is just fun for me. And so I wanted to share this with all of you guys to maybe encourage you, inspire you, or at the very least appreciate what goes into your beer a little bit more. So thank you very much. I'll turn it back over to them for their raffle, but then I'll be available for questions. All right, yeah, so I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have. Again, I am just a nerd, not an expert, so I will just do my best. But who's got questions? Who wants to ask? Yeah. Yeah, you go first, because he also behind you raised his hand too. Same spot, same time. If you can speak loudly, just so everybody can hear. I don't know. I do not know the mythology that well, but that is actually something super interesting to look up. So, how did you spell that? Ceres. Yeah, no, I don't think there's necessary, but I don't know. So there we go. There's my first. I don't know. Told you. All right. Did you have a question as well? Yeah. Yeah, so in case you didn't hear what he asked, basically he was asking about fermentation temperature, whether or not that's the fermentation of the, or the temperature of the air around it, or the temperature of the actual wort itself. And the answer is it's the temperature of the actual wort itself, what it's actually suspended in. One thing you can actually do is you can buy these things called firm wraps. And they're basically, they look like tiny, super thin solar panels that you can wrap around your fermentation chamber and actually tell it to control its temperature. You drop a tiny little temperature probe inside and it goes, yes, it is 65.3 degrees. I need to warm this up by 0.7 degrees. It does that for you. So, but yeah, it's the temperature inside and especially if you use a firm wrap, that counts for the warming. But if you're doing a large volume of beer, that temperature change doesn't really happen anyway. So it's a lot smaller that it warms up like that. So good question. Other questions? Yes. Where do I do trivia? Great question. 6 out for rallies, 7 p.m. We do 3 rounds. First round is of general knowledge, second round is a picture round, third round is a music round. That's all I'm going to say because I don't want to take away business from 7 C's. But it's at Pirelli's tomorrow night. So if you think I'm funny, come see me there too. Because I tell more about jokes. Huh? Thursday. So, did I say tomorrow? Thursdays. Thursdays. not Tuesdays or Fridays or Wednesdays or whatever day of the week it is. I really can't keep track of the days.
You're mentioning that earliest beers were oatmeal texture.
Mhm.
How do they know that it was beer that was oatmeal texture and not the byproduct?
Yeah.
The leftover heavy.
Okay, so her question was that I had mentioned that the earliest beers were more of the oatmeal texture versus what we think of today. How did they know that the good part was the beer and not the mash? I don't think we'll ever actually know how they got to that point, but there was a point early on where the Egyptians figured it out and invented straws to get through the oatmeal at the very least. So I don't know how. Yeah, it was like a layer was floating at the top. So I don't know how they necessarily got to figuring out that this stuff is the good stuff, but they figured it out fast. So, and like I said, they were crazy straws too. They had like bends and all sorts of things. It was not just like your standard straw. It's not how it works. So. Any other questions? Yeah.
For the prohibition data you're talking about, like finding a new way to think, is that just sort of like have a way of saying, well, this isn't beer, even though we're getting drunk?
Yes.
And like, how does that work in practice? If people are out and about seeing drunk, wouldn't they still be, is that a problem under prohibition, or was it like, did they really get away with it?
Yeah, so the question was basically during Prohibition, they had changed all of the recipes to be that corn and malt. Were people getting away with this? Or corn and rice, I keep saying corn and malt. Were people getting away with still brewing with corn and rice? Yes and no. That's kind of the same with Prohibition everywhere else in the US. Some people were like, yeah, no, totally, we've got beer. You come on in, come on in. And they were totally fine. Other people definitely got, it was not hard and fast. They were still recognizing that people were drinking and things like that. So it was not a clean and cut, like, oh, I am, this is not alcohol. It's fine. It's good. It definitely got people in trouble, but it was a way that they got around it for a while. So great question. Yeah.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah.
So he was reminiscing on his times where beers were a little bit less in the percentage, like 3 or 4%, which was typical in the past, but now they tend to be climbing up higher, up to 7, 9, 13%. I think I saw an 18% beer, which I feel like you can't even call beer at that point. That is just asking for a long night. I wouldn't necessarily, I mean, yes, it is a trend, but it's not necessarily in seeking that higher alcohol volume. It's more of we are craft and we're adding more and more into our beer, and that's what's creating additional alcohol. Especially too, because like I said, it wasn't until the 70s, mid-70s that craft brews started taking off. And so most of the beers that were available were these domestic beers, and they're going to get away with as little grain as they possibly can. And so that's why we have a lot of the weaker beers at like 3 or 4%. And now there's, breweries like this that are like, all right, I'm not compromising. I want flavor. How do I do it? So not intentionally a trend. I think I saw another question. Yeah. Yeah. So question was on full oculation, what that means in terms of are some of the yeast dead, some of them are still alive? Yes, the answer is both. Some of the yeast are absolutely still alive, but a lot of them are dead toward the end of fermentation. And thankfully, at least I think so, yeast don't have a brain and recognize that they're snuggling up with their dead friends there. But that's exactly it though, is they will still group, and I think I just horrified somebody too much with that one. They do group together and whatnot, and you can literally use the trug from the last beer, like I said, all that stuff that falls out, and there's enough yeast in it to ferment your next beer. A lot of breweries will use the same yeast over and over and over again because they know it works. They know that that's the yeast. There's a couple of breweries, especially over in England, that do wild fermentation. They just leave their tanks open and random yeasts fall in, and that's their beer, and it's great. Sam Smith is, I think, is one of the oldest ones that have been doing it. Sam Smith in England. So yeah. Fantastic.
All right, thank you so much for coming. Let's give Caitlin one more round of applause. So we just checked and Jim doesn't have additional think and drinks on the website, but keep checking and I'm sure there'll be some either later this summer or the fall. And thank you so much for coming.